let's get started with section B. So there are a few figures, but I'm going to go straight to the questions and then work backwards. Okay, so this 5 marker. Okay, so this is calculate, very rare question, but we'll go through it to make sure you don't waste any time, and I'm going to try to demonstrate how simple this is. So what's the question? Calculate the percentage change in the value of the euro in pounds from the start of 2009 to the start of 2015. So percentage change, euro in pounds, start of 2009 to the start of 2015. And let's have a look at the figures. Okay, I think it said does it say figure 1? Yeah, figure 1. Okay, so reference figure 1, so start of 2009 to start of 2015. It looks like it's actually highlighted them for us, so there's 2 little circles here. Okay, so what is it? The price of €1 in terms of a pound is 0.95 in 2019, and then of course you just calculate percentage change in 2050. So in 2009 it was 0.95, then in 2015 it's depreciated to 0.75. And then you divide it by the original, which original of course being 0.95 and 100, and that is literally. But remember one other thing here as well. So like I said, the pound is depreciated, so whatever this value is, we just put a negative sign in front of it. Now I need to grab my trusty calculator and work this out. And that has given me 21.05, so 21.05%. And like I said, since the pound is depreciated, it's a negative sign. And literally, I would of course add this formula in, and then but all you need for the 5 marks here, and this is why this 5 mark question you can literally do it in under a minute. You can get 5 marks here. All you need to do for the answer there is the percentage change is 21.05, and that's if you just wrote that, nothing else. But the reason why we say sure workings is if you get it wrong, you still pick up a few marks. But as long as you do that, and of course the percentage sign, of course, you would pick up the 5 mark. Okay, so that's a very easy 5 marker done, and let's move on to the 8 mark question. So what is the 8 mark question saying? So with a reference to the information provided, so of course application marks, this is 8 marks of course. With the reference to information provided and your own knowledge, examine 2 factors. So we want 2 factors, so that's going to be 2K paragraphs here, or 2 paragraphs, which might explain the change in the rate of Eurozone inflation, to change the rate of Eurozone inflation as shown in figure 2. In figure 2, what does it show? A change in inflation. So there's a decrease, so there's disinflation basically. So from 2011 to 2015 there has been disinflation, or just a decrease in inflation rate. So we need to give 2 reasons, 2 factors which might explain the change in the rate of Eurozone inflation. And now figure 1 doesn't tell us much. Figure 1 tells us the price of the euro relative to the pound. We found out that it's depreciated 21%, but that could be either pound appreciating or it could be the euro depreciating. It doesn't give us so it could be either one of them. It could be both. It could be a combination of both. It likely is a combination of both, but that could be the pound appreciating or the euro depreciating, but we don't know, so that doesn't give us any conclusive bit to talk about. This just tells us that it's disinflation, so I'm probably going to have to use extract A here. What does extract A start with? Alright, so European Central Bank disappoints markets with a weaker than expected stimulus. So that looks quite good, to be honest. So just the title itself. So if the markets are disappointed, what does that make me think of? It makes me think of animal spirits, consumer confidence, things like that. And that is definitely one point I can write about. But if there's a bit more of a solid point, I will probably pick it out. Okay, so I've had to read through this paragraph. There's not much in this. It just talks about interest rates, quantitative easing, a bit of asset prices. So that is probably going to be my first paragraph point, and this is probably a bit of a tricky 8 mark question. But for my second paragraph, because it says state 2 reasons, I'm probably going to use this part of it. There's quite a few decent evaluation points in this, but here. So it says the euro rose almost 3% against the dollar, and I think that's a really good second reason. So another reason why we might there might be disinflation basically is due to appreciation of the euro compared to other currencies. Okay, so let's get on with answering this. So the 8 mark question. Okay, so since it's mainly about inflation, I'd start with defining inflation, which is just a sustained increase in general price level. And since I'm going to quote the extract, so I'm going to quote figure 2, I'm just going to throw another definition in here, which is disinflation, because I'm going to refer to this figure 2, and I'm going to say that since 2011, the Eurozone has suffered a disinflation. Okay, so my first factor is going to be a decrease in consumer /investor, and I'd call that animal spirits, but decrease in consumer /investor confidence. So I'd probably back that up by just literally quoting the extract. So I'd say something like, one reason there has been disinflation in the Eurozone is due to a decrease in consumer and investor confidence. For example, just quote the extract. So in extract A it says, the markets are disappointed with a weaker stimulus than expected. With reduced consumer confidence and reduced investor confidence, this is going to lead to a decrease in consumption and investment, which are both components of AD, and consumption makes up about 60% of AD, which is a significant proportion of AD, meaning that this is going to cause, if we look at AD, and I would actually draw a diagram here because it's very fast and simple, so this is going to cause AD to shift in to AD1. And when AD shifts into AD1, this means price level is decreasing from PLE to PL1, thus meaning that this leads to a decrease in inflation rate or disinflation, which could be one reason why the Eurozone is suffering from deflation or disinflation. And that's pretty much all you need, because remember, you're doing two different reasons here, and it's only 8 marks. That's all. That is more than enough depth with regards to that. Just make sure for your 8 mark question, classic mistake I see students make sure you include an evaluation point, because there's obviously 2 marks here reserved for evaluation. And like I said before, I was looking at the context earlier, you can use the several different evaluation points you can use there. Depends on the proportion of AD affected, depends on the level of consumer confidence decreased, investor confidence decreased, as if it decreased a bit, it's obviously going to have a different effect on AD. So if it decreases slightly, price level is only going to decrease slightly. If it's a massive change, obviously, but price level is going to change massively. But a really good one point here, and I'll use this because it's the extract, is economists reduced inflation rate, but basically they expect inflation rate to rise in 2017. So you could say, however, this depends on the long run, as economists expect inflation rate to rise to 1.6% in 2017. And that is all I've written for this first paragraph, and then my second paragraph, like I've written here, would be due to the appreciation of the euro. And I do understand this question, 8 marks, is because it's asking you to examine 2 factors which might explain. It's again a bit of an inference. You have to kind of think of them yourself. You have to really drag it out the extract. I do understand they can be a bit difficult sometimes. And of course, with that first paragraph also, or even with the second paragraph, there is, remember, 2 marks here reserved for application. Since I'm just verbally saying it, I'm not going to say it, but if I was writing this, I would 100% in 1 or 2 of or both paragraphs, whenever you talk about disinflation, just quote one of the figures to say, for example, this disinflation occurred from 2011-2015, where inflation rate fell from 3.1 to 0.25, whatever you want to say. Just basically quote the extracts to pick up those 2 application marks. So how does an appreciation of the euro lead to basically disinflation? So I would use the good old acronym of SPICY. Of course, this is not pound, it's euros now. So stronger euro, imports cheaper, exports expensive. So I'd pretty much say an appreciation of the euro, since imports are cheaper, exports are more expensive, I would just focus on exports. When you have an appreciation of the euro, the exports are more expensive, thus meaning our exports are less competitive on global markets, meaning it decreases export revenue, so that there's less sales of exports. If there's less sales of exports, if we're getting less export revenue, if we think about our AD formula, which is C plus I plus G plus X minus M, so there's less X, which is less X, which is exports, meaning that this is going to cause, if there's less X, this means there's less AD. So there's less AD, and well, that's basically again showing the same thing. AD shifts in, thus leading to a decrease in price level, thus causing the disinflation, which is happening in the Eurozone. And if you want to evaluate this, obviously there's 2 marks of evaluation. You probably have done enough in the first bit, but maybe didn't evaluate in your first paragraph. You can say, however, this depends on the level of imported inflation. As imports are cheaper now with the appreciation of the euro, it means we're going to import more. There's more import expenditure, meaning that, of course, one big thing with imports is you import the inflation as well, basically. So, for example, if the price of grapes are increasing rapidly and you're importing grapes, you're importing a bit of that inflation. So, basically the way I'd word it. However, it depends on the level of imported inflation, as in the long run it could mean that imported inflation could rise the Eurozone inflation rates. But that is a very simple summary on the 8 mark question. Like I said, independently it might be a bit difficult to answer, but you have to kind of get used to these questions with Edexcel. They do like to really, since this is pretty much your own knowledge question. And one thing to mention here, since this is a 2017 paper, and depending on when you are answering this, a lot of the factors, I've just showed the mark scheme now, let me just have a look at it. So the mark scheme here, it says a few of the points like falling oil prices, falling commodity prices. If you didn't get them, I wouldn't be too worried. This is why I focus a bit more on the extract rather than points, because remember, this came out in 2017, and around that time is when oil prices were falling, commodity prices were falling. So if you were sitting the paper around that time, you should have known that oil prices were falling and commodity prices falling, thus meaning that you probably would have written something like that. But now, since if you're doing it for practice as a past paper, the first thing that comes to your mind is probably not oil prices falling, since oil prices are spiking massively right now. So don't worry too much about the mark scheme points. This is why I try to deduce the points from the extract, so you guys can actually replicate that, and it means that it's something that you can actually do yourself. So what I'm saying there, don't worry too much about the mark scheme points, since if you were sitting in that year, you probably would have written those points as well, since it was topical back then, and right now obviously falling oil prices isn't very topical. Okay, so moving on to the next question, which is a 10-mark question. So let's have a shot to this. So since mid-2015, the euro has appreciated. So that's literally exactly how we answered our 8-mark question. But remember, that's completely fine. All questions are marked independently. You'll actually see a lot of the times the questions do overlap. So if you've written about, for example, we wrote about pretty much about spicy in question 8. You can still 100% write about that in question 10, because, like I said, each question is marked independently. But since mid-2015, the euro has appreciated. Assess the likely impact of an appreciation of the euro on the current account of the balance of payments. So basically, it's another spicy question. The only difference here, you're probably just going to go into a bit more detail, and then, since for the 10 mark there are 4 evaluation marks, a bit more evaluation. So quite literally, my first paragraph is going to be imports cheaper, thus increase in import expenditure. And then how is increase in import expenditure going to affect the current account? It's going to lead to a worsening of the current account. And secondly, of course, is going to be exports expensive. So decrease in export revenue, thus again worsening the current account. And of course, I explain these in a step-by-step manner, saying as the euro appreciates, it means exports are more expensive relative to other currencies. You can even give an example, like, for example, Argentinian pesos. It means that the euro will now, the European exports, or the Eurozone exports, are more expensive in terms of Argentinian pesos. So before it might have been 240 Argentinian pesos, and now, since the euro has appreciated, it's 250 Argentinian pesos. And of course, here link it to the extract, so throw this in just for your application marks, because remember, there are still 2 application marks here. You do need to pick them up. So then straight away, if we think back to our 5-mark question, what do we find out in our 5-mark question? In our 5-mark question, if we read back to it, we calculate the percentage change in the value of euros in terms of pounds. Worked out that it's minus 21.5%. So basically, that's telling us the euro has depreciated in terms of pounds. So that works as a really good evaluation point. You say, however, this depends on the euro appreciating against all other currencies. The euro actually depreciated by 21.5% against the British pound, thus meaning the appreciation of the euro may not be felt by every single currency, thus negating the negative effects of the appreciation, and that is an absolute solid evaluation point. And since these analysis marks are the 6 KA marks, to be really simple, is to just make sure you pick up your 2 application marks, then to explain these in a step-by-step manner, then you've picked up pretty much with that evaluation point, you might have even picked up all 4 of the evaluation marks. But another one you can think about is time frame. So here, you talk about just time frame, saying in the short run the euro may appreciate, and then in the long run it may like not appreciate, it may depreciate. So you just talk about the different time frames, and that is more than enough for those 4 marks of evaluation. And like I said, you pretty much might be able to get away with it with that first point, depending on how much depth you write in. But yeah, that is a 10 marker. That's probably one of the easiest 10 markers I've seen, and it's really good. It's a nice 10 marker to get. If you get anything like that, you need to smash out of the park. Moving on to the 12-mark question. So let's have a shot at this. Discuss the likely success of the European Central Bank's quantitative easing. So the success of the European Central Bank's quantitative easing program in moving the Eurozone inflation closer to 2%, basically. Okay, first thing I'm going to do here is have a reread of this, because this basically tells us how successful it was. And remember, so these figures 100% would be using a lot of these here. So extends 60 billion monthly. The scheme has already been through 1.1 trillion of QE. We are doing more because it works. So the scheme will continue since it worked. That sounds pretty good and pretty valuable to use. Also, there's a bit more towards the end. Okay, and here. So the question's asking, has QE been successful in raising the Eurozone inflation rate, basically? And this says, via predictions, by just 1% in 2016 and 1.6%, and we're getting towards that 2%. That 2% ceiling, which is what we want to do, and so it means it is working. Okay, so this is how I would answer it. I would start by just defining two key terms, so quantitative easing, interest rates, whatever you want to define, whatever works. And then for my paragraph, I would go about saying, I believe it is a success so the quantitative easing program is a success. As inflation is getting closer to the 2% ceiling, then I would say, for example, this is shown as, I would quote this extract and just say basically it's getting closer to 2% as it's expected to be 1.6% in 2017. Then I would go about saying, because I want to use, remember this is 12-mark question, you want to have the application in there, and I'd go about using these two stats. The Eurozone has undergone extensive quantitative easing program, with it being 1.1 trillion originally, and it's agreed to extend it 60 billion. And the reason why they have agreed to extend it 60 billion, and the reason why they are continuing it, and then I would basically go on to explain what quantitative easing is and the method of quantitative easing. So central bank creates new money. So when central banks creates new money, they buy government bonds plus assets from banks. What does this do? This increases banks, and this is a really good key term, liquidity, and you may have revised a ratio like liquidity ratios, things like that. And if banks have more liquidity, what does it mean? It means they can lend more money, and that's the main quantitative easing bit of it basically. So central bank creates new money electronically, and they use that to buy basically banks' assets, banks' bonds. This increases banks' liquidity, which increases their ability to lend more money. And then you can basically link it to anything, saying that you can link it to interest rates, or you can just say if banks can lend more money, they have more liquidity. It means that it's easier for consumers to gain loans. It's easier for the firms to gain loans, meaning that it increases consumption, increases investment in the economy, and then it's just a classic chain of analysis. Increase consumption, increase investment. Therefore, it's going to consumption is about 60% of AD. Thus, shift AD out. When AD shifts out, it's going to cause, and 100% draw the diagram here. LRS, whatever you want. I would draw LRS here. Why instead of SRS? Since LRS is easier to evaluate, and of course there are big evaluation marks here. So when we use quantitative easing, it is going to cause AD to shift out to AD1 due to the increase in consumption and investment, therefore causing price levels to increase from PLE to PL1. And what type of inflation is that? That is demand pull inflation. And then another side effect you can talk about, if we look at the diagram again, so we've seen AD shifted out, we've talked about price level, but if we look at the other axis, which is real GDP and price level, obviously here, real GDP has increased from YE to now Y1. How does that affect the economy? How does that affect the Eurozone? If real GDP is increasing massively, well, if your real GDP is increasing, the main thing it's going to affect is investor consumer confidence. The consumers seeing the economy is growing. It's another positive signal. It can lead to things like multiplier effects. But the main thing is a positive sign. Therefore, if it shows the economy is doing well, and if the economy is doing well, it means confidence will be high. And if confidence is high, it maintains at high levels of consumption, maintains at high levels of investment in the economy. So it's another positive effect of quantitative easing. And how would you evaluate this? I would again just go back to the extract, have a read of this, and try to think of an evaluation point from this extract. But first thing, I underlined this earlier, we're doing more because it works. They said they're extending the QE program a further 6 months, but this shows, you see how of an evaluation, the original massive QE scheme didn't do the job, did it? That's why they're having to extend it. So the initial period is having to be extended, since it did not achieve the goal of meeting that 2% inflation rate. So that's definitely a good evaluation point there. And then towards the end, a great evaluation point here, Mr. Dagri, or whatever his name is, Mr. Dagri basically says that monetary policy alone, which is just quantitative easing, interest rates, cannot restore the Eurozone's inflation. We need to use other policies like fiscal policy, basically. And yeah, that's a really good evaluation point. So however, in evaluation, this depends on the use or the effective use of other policies to therefore restore the Eurozone's inflation. And of course, it's a very general point about quantitative easing with regards to evaluation. It's just time lag. It takes time for this money to be translated into the economy. We say generally it takes 12 to 18 months for any economic policy to actually show some effect, show some fruition in the economy. So for example, if this quantitative easing program has just happened now, we have to wait at least 18 months to see any effects of this quantitative easing. So you could say, however, this depends on the time lag, and then explain what I just said. There are lots of evaluation points there. You can think of a few for yourself as well. But a lot of the marks here, I think it's quite a decent 12-mark question. a lot of the marks here will just be that step-by-step chain of analysis, making sure firstly use enough application, explain quantitative easing in relevant detail, and then decent evaluation points, and that should be enough for 12 out of 12 on that question. Moving on to the 15-mark question. This is a discuss question. So discuss looser fiscal policy and supply-side reforms in extract A that may be used by the government in Eurozone countries to increase economic growth. Now, first reactions to that 15-mark question is a very nice, a very broad 15-mark question where you can include lots of your economics knowledge to pick up those 15 marks. As if you remember back to the extract, in that last paragraph of extract A, it was talking about how with monetary policy, you would have to use, for monetary policy to be effective, you'd have to use fiscal and then supply side policies. So it's basically giving you free roam for you to pick any fiscal, any sort of supply side policy you want to use, and then just use your economics theory to explain it. I'll do 2 paragraphs here, just like you need for a 15-mark question. One, of course, being on looser fiscal policy, and one being on supply side reform. Let's start with the loose fiscal policy paragraph. Now, there's different words for fiscal policy. Sometimes you'll hear loose, and sometimes you hear tight fiscal policy, and it's exactly the same as contractionary and expansionary monetary fiscal policy. So, loose fiscal policy is just the same as expansionary fiscal policy. And what are the 2 components that build up fiscal policy is, of course, tax, and then it is government spending. And in expansionary / loose fiscal policy, what do we do to tax, especially tax rate, and what do we do to government spending? So we usually decrease taxes and we try to increase government spending. And the way I used to remember it, so expansionary fiscal policy, same as loose. Why? Because you're being very loose with your money. You don't really care what happens to the money, so you're giving out lots in government spending, not taking a lot in. Whilst tight fiscal policy, contractionary, you care about every penny basically. You want as much tax and then not giving out the least amount of government spending. And of course, fiscal policy and supply side policy does overlap. For example, if we government spend on schooling, it's still expansionary fiscal policy, but it's also supply side policy. So how do you differentiate them? Just as a quick reminder, supply side policy, if it depends, the main goal matters basically. What your main goal is. If your main goal is to increase LRAS, we would call it supply side policy. If your main goal is to stimulate AD, so increase AD, shift out AD, we would call it fiscal policy. So let's give some examples of a policy you could speak about for your fiscal policy paragraph. I think a great one would always be less income tax. Okay, so what would my chain of analysis be for my less income tax paragraph? So first thing I would 100% talk about is disposable income. So less income tax means consumers and households have more disposable income. This is going to increase their purchasing power, meaning they have more consumer confidence, thus increasing consumption, which is a component of AD, and it's the majority component of AD. It makes up around 60% of AD. So how is that going to affect AD? It's also, of course, going to cause AD to shift out. And you can also talk about the side effects, where the increase in consumption is also going to increase another component of AD, being investment. Why? Because firms are making more sales, revenues, profits, and if they're making more profits, they may want to expand, invest. Therefore, you can talk about derived demand for labour. They increase their derived demand for labour, increasing things like employment. But the main chain of analysis is basically more disposable income is increased consumption. Consumption is about 60% of AD, causes AD to shift out to the right. Therefore, increase in it can be demand pull inflation, but the main thing is an increase in real GDP. Also, once you mention consumption causing a shift out of AD, you can link it to the LRS diagram, as you can mention this. So you can say that the shift out of AD helps close the negative output gap generated by different stages of the business cycle. As if we think back to government policies, when will the government use expansionary policies, such as loose or expansionary fiscal policy? During what stage of the business cycle? They would use it during the recession stage, as they want to stimulate AD, they want to get the economy out of this negative output gap or a recession. And therefore, it makes the chain of analysis link really well together. So by using loose fiscal policy, by the consumption increasing, it causes AD to shift out to AD2, which means now we're back at full employment and the negative output gap has been closed. And I'd only pick one of these 2 points, but another one you could go into is less corporation tax. And what is corporation tax? Is a percentage of a firm's profits. So it's a tax on the percentage of their profits. So if you have a less corporation tax, it means firms have more retained profit, thus meaning that they're more likely to invest. And of course, investment is a component of AD, causing AD to shift out to AD1 and all the same effects as before, increasing real GDP. Now, just as a reminder, I'm just giving you points here. Of course, for this question, it's 3K AA, so 3K, 3A, 3A. So 3 application marks. So you need to make sure you're using the extracts in this 15-mark question. of course. Now, for fiscal policy, it's a very easy and a very good one to evaluate. And one of my favourite evaluations is indeed the Laffer curve. Now, why does the Laffer curve work well here? So we have tax revenue on your y-axis. This is the most confused thing with the Laffer curve. Why most students I see when I'm marking scripts, why they drop marks is because they mix these two labels up, and then tax rate on your y-axis. Now, why does this work in evaluation? So we are basically saying, we'll give the example of income tax. We're saying that less income tax is going to lead to a higher rate, a higher tax revenue, because that's the classic assumption. So if we tax you less, it's going to lead to more tax revenue. So basically what we're saying, we might be moving from point X to point A, since tax rate is going down, thus we're predicting an increase in tax revenue. And that's a valid valid assumption. However, this let's throw a spanner in the works. So we've called this point Z. What if we decrease tax rate? What if the Eurozone is currently at point A, and when we decrease tax rate, we go down to point Z? This means by decreasing tax rate, we've actually decreased tax revenue. A great evaluation here for fiscal policy, since we're talking about expansionary, has to be, again, using the LRAS curve. And let's just zoom into this, so LRAS. And I'm going to say, and it's a classic, but it's a very good one, and it picked up a lot of marks in the exam. It depends on the position of the Keynesian LRAS. So it depends on the position of the Eurozone economy on the Keynesian LRAS. As if this is the original position of the Eurozone economy, so if it's originally at full capacity on the Keynesian LRAS curve, when we decrease tax revenue, what do we say is going to happen? It's going to, at the end, it's going to stimulate AD, cause an increase in aggregate demand, causing AD to shift out to AD1. What effects does this had? If we look at this now, real GDP stays at YE, and we only get inflationary pressures. So the evaluation point basically says it depends on the original starting point of the Eurozone economy. As if they're starting at full capacity, it means even if they pursue expansionary or loose fiscal policy, there's going to be no benefits in terms of real GDP. So there's going to be no economic growth, and there's only going to be inflationary pressures. Thus, loose fiscal policy in that scenario would not be the best choice. Great evaluation point if worded well. I understand it might be slightly complex for a few students, but it's a 10 out of 10 A-star evaluation point. So it depends on the original position of the Eurozone economy on its LRAS curve. And then, of course, a classic one you can add in here as well is just time lag. So it depends on the short run versus the long run. As like I always say, it takes about 12 to 18 months for any economic policy to take effect. Therefore, it would take 12 to 18 months. So in the short run, the effects will not be felt.